Hmm.
All this is Dr. Mobeen Sayed from drbeen.com. Welcome to one more show. So today we have a cool bean that you are already aware of. Uh, Paul Bork is with us. So first of all, Paul Bork, very, very warm welcome. And how are you feeling?
I'm feeling very good. Pretty much completely recovered from the Omicron.
Got it. And we were talking about it. If you don't mind, can I just mention your?
Certainly.
So you had COVID before, then you had a vaccine, and now you have Omicron.
Correct. Had two Moderna.
To Moderna. And what is the difference? So you had COVID before Moderna, and then you have COVID now. Any difference between the two intensities of
Yes,
the?
this one was more upper respiratory, runny nose, that kind of thing. No lung involvement, no dropping of the oxygen blood content, and it was a lot milder.
Very good, very good. So wishing you safe, happy, healthy days, and hopefully you're recovered fully very soon. I can hear a little bit of a congestion in your voice, and then thank you very much for joining us even during this. That is a cool bean move.
Well, thank you.
And for the Cool Beans Paul is a BS Chemical Engineering, a Six Sigma black belt for process focusing on the practical application of statistics to real world problems. He's retired, but he's also a lawyer and an MBA, and he volunteers teaching science, technology, engineering, and math at local school. So, Paul, once again, welcome. And what is the topic? So, this is a topic that you and I were discussing, and I thought this was really cool. For me, that was a interesting topic, and I thought at our coffee table, let's discuss it with the cool beans as well. So, what is the topic for today?
Very good. It's there's a reason in the regulations, an additional reason that I wasn't aware of before, why drug companies would be adverse to having off-label therapeutics going forward. And so thought it was useful for this presentation to sort of review what the rules are, why this may be, and not trying to say it's the only reason, but it's just a reason that I wasn't aware of myself until a short while ago and wanted to share that with the rest of the Cool Beans.
Very good. Thank you very much. And you were talking about these two flags as well. So, would you mind telling us about the flags?
These two flags, actually, I was working in Michigan on Texas stuff, and one of my clients came up and was there and said, "How would anyone know you're doing Texas things?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know." And so he talked to the state representative, and I got a Texas flag that flew over the Texas Capitol, and that's the one flag, first flag. And then a little later on, I was doing something else, and I got a flag that flew over the national Capitol. So those are two U.S. flag and a Texas flag. So
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So, shall I bring your presentation up and we put
that would
it
be very
together?
good.
Excellent. So,
And
just let me know
as
whenever you need the slide to change.
okay, and as people may remember, when we were picking names, I wanted EndBeen because I'm looking for the end of this pandemic, and I'm still looking for it, but it looks like it might be closer. So you can go to the next one. Okay, if we just look at the top part, the FDA regulations are part of the reason for this. And the FDA medicine regulations are the root of the real reason that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to review the rules 3 times, start very generically, a little more depth, and then a little additional depth. And the one that's in the middle is the first level of detail, which is just one line. It's all about the label. The FDA does not really regulate the for approvals, doesn't regulate the anything other than the label. The label is the critical part, and anything that isn't labeled correctly or the way they want is a mislabeled drug, and there's severe criminal and civil penalties that the FDA can and does enforce against people. So they focus on the label.
Got it.
Going to the lines that are down below that, drugs that existed when the FDA rules first started in 1938 are grandfathered. They don't have a labeling requirement. They don't have a testing requirement. They just continue to be able to be prescribed or used. And I
That's
found,
interesting. So aspirin, acetaminophen, oh, codeine, colchicine, although I think colchicine is not available here without prescription, but the label can be whatever. Is that the point?
right, that it's not regulated, it's grandfathered.
Got it.
And the
Thank
little
you.
bitty writing that you see after grandfather, that's the site that had a list of these. So,
Got it.
you know, I think it's right. I don't know that it's right, but like nitroglycerin, there's a lot of morphine. You know, they've been around for a long time, and they have never gone through proving they're safe and effective and getting a label that talks about what they're doing. But again,
Got it.
it's the label. Now, new drugs starting in 1938, and they've changed it several times, need the extensive, expensive evidence to get FDA approval for the label. It's all about the label. And the label addresses what dosage, what disease it can treat, important side effects. And if a company thinks a side effect is important and the FDA thinks it is not, then the company cannot put that on the label. And conversely, if a company doesn't think it's important and the FDA does, it's got to go on the label. And if the FDA doesn't approve the label, you can't sell it in the US. And the sponsors can change the label while asking FDA permission in very limited cases. And that's important for the future. But most of the time, you need the FDA approval to go do things. Now,
So
one of the
I have a
questions.
question, and I don't know if you would have the answer or not, but still, the supplements and the other such things, which are probably not very much regulated by FDA, are there any rules and regulations around that as well?
Those are not regulated as drugs, and they don't apply. This regulation doesn't apply. One of the things to keep in mind is we have a dual government system, at least two levels of government. So the state regulates things and the federal regulates on top of it. So until 1938, there wasn't the FDA regulation, and so the states regulated all of it. Now, the states probably regulate the supplements, and so from state to state, they probably have different requirements and rules and different cases and liabilities that may come out of what's going on. But the FDA does not regulate supplements as drugs.
Got it. Thank you.
And as a result of that, the FDA is very careful that people can't make claims that it cures a disease. And I've seen supplements where they go out of their way to say, oh, this might help you, but I can't say it goes to, we're not saying it's a drug, but, one of my friends said it helped him, so, or whatever. Does that answer the question?
It does. I understand. Thank you.
Okay. Now, generic drugs only have to show they're equivalent to a new drug, and that it needs to have an identical label at all times, identical. Can't change one word, can't do anything because it is tied to the original drug. And typically with patent protection, you have someone coming in trying to get market when they have patent protection to stop anyone else. And then once the patent runs out, a little before, the generic guys jump in and try to get their label. Now, one of the places I was looking at says that it can take up to 3 years for the FDA to approve a generic label. It's like, if it's exactly the same, and anyway, I don't know why it takes 3 years, but it's also true that the grandfathered drugs, someone could go and submit an application to become a sponsor. They don't have to be a new inventor. So if someone wanted to pick up aspirin, they could go do it and then probably block everyone else for the 3 years that it took for them to get a co-license, to get the generic label equivalent. But again, that very expensive. People don't do that, but it can be done, and apparently has been done with some of the grandfathered drugs. The next thing is off-label drugs are not regulated by the FDA, and the sponsors are not allowed to say anything about that, because they would say, even if you say, well, this could hurt 90% of the people that take it, you're encouraging people to take it. And so You're not allowed to do that.
So
Some of the
tell me
courts.
this then.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, my apologies for the interruption. For the off-label, so there is a doctor's right, for example, to be able to prescribe off-label the approved, authorized drugs. Can the sponsor also say that this can be off-label or not off-label?
They can't do anything to encourage off-label use.
I see.
Can't talk about it, can't talk about side effects, can't do anything. In fact, some of the courts have said this is infringing their First Amendment right to speak. And I am not, that hasn't been resolved, but that's how far the FDA goes in saying you can't say anything.
I see. So if, let's say, I am the sponsor of a drug and somebody comes to me and says, can I use this as an off-label? I will protect myself by saying no. Or will I say no comment?
You say no comment. Which we can think of an example where a sponsor of a drug that was asked for off-label support for use pulled out. And my bet is that's exactly why. Or at least if I were in their legal department, I would certainly suggest they think about not doing that. Now, the FDA can require a label change to address off-label use, which is very rare. They have a number of procedural hurdles they have to meet. And what they do is they'll require a change, but they restrict it to themselves the decision ability. You can't, if a company isn't happy with the off-label use of their product, they can't go out and put warning labels or start advertising this is horrible or whatever.
So there's an interesting question by Kool Been. I'm going to put it up and totally up to you to decide or say yes or no. Since it's all about the label, John says, the present Pfizer vaccine is not FDA approved, but it's presented as such. Comirnaty, the FDA approved vaccine, is not available. So isn't that a discrepancy?
I'll answer yes, John, it appears to be, but I'm only talking about the very basic FDA regulations. There's also an emergency use authorization program that allows the FDA to approve drugs for short periods of time for emergencies under certain other conditions. I'm not talking about that, but my understanding is the vaccine meets the requirements for the emergency use authorization, the EUA. And if they get the total approval, then for vaccines, there's certain liability protections that kick in that don't apply during the emergency use authorization. And so some would suggest that they're chasing the indemnity that they got, and whether they are or not, I don't know. But the emergency use authorization is a completely different program with different requirements and different limitations, and I haven't really looked at it that closely.
Got it. Thank you very much. Should I move to the next one?
Yeah, well, let me say one other thing. I do know that the FDA did require a change in labeling of one of the emergency use authorization vaccines because of a concern. I think it was the myocarditis, I believe.
Yeah, myocarditis, and one was thrombocytopenia. So they asked to add the label advice.
Right. So my understanding is from that, there is a label requirement. It's a little different, but it's probably somewhat the same.
Got it.
Okay. Now, this is the third time to go through go to the next page. Okay, before I go through it again, I had what I thought were two interesting drug stories. And one is aspirin. And I have down here a legal term, information and belief, which means someone told me and I believe them, that someone that knows how FDA works that was talking to me said that the existing studies on the efficacy and safety of aspirin would not allow it to be approved today. So two things. One, we have a drug that's widely used that is more dangerous than all the new drugs or doesn't meet those requirements. And two, if we have a new drug that is just as safe as aspirin and just as useful, we're not letting it through. So either way, you can look at it and say, I'm not sure that's what I would really want as a consumer in the United States, but that's what I was told. And then, does that make sense?
It does. It's very interesting, actually. I did not know this before.
And then I want to talk about something interesting I heard. Coca-Cola, which is a soft drink, started as a drug. And it contained codeine. And supposedly they removed codeine, but they still have some cocaine product in it. Not the drug, but they have some of the flavoring from, it's the one non-regulated product in the US that has elements from the plant. And it was initially provided in a 4-ounce serving. Think how far we've come since then. And I don't know if there's any old Kool Beans that remember when Pepsi got started, their jingle was, and I won't sing it, Pepsi-Cola hits the spot, 8 full ounces, that's a lot. Twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi-Cola hits the spot.
That is fun.
Right.
We should sing it.
A fun thing. And so now you can go and you can get an 80-ounce Coke serving at some of the places or whatever, and people wonder why we have an obesity crisis, even though Coke has been sold for a long time. Well, it was, but not quite the same way.
Interesting.
You can go to the next page. Now I'm going back to the most in-depth FDA discussion of it. And you can see the 2 little arrows, and they point to the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, which will, if you are really interested and want to look it up, you can just do a Google search on that wording, and you will find the actual regulation. So that's what lawyers do. And some of them, the FDA went through and changed some of their rules by just moving section numbers around, which makes it difficult to find. But anyway, so the FDA has to approve the usage of new drugs. They have to be found safe and effective under the FDA requirements, and they have to approve the label language, and they have to approve almost all label changes before they occur. The one exception, and I'm giving you the legal term here, changes being affected, CBE. You can change, the company can change the label and then get approval. Now this is just the sponsor now. You remember, they're divided in 2 groups, the sponsor and the generics. The sponsor is the only one who really has control of the label. All the generics just have to follow along and be identical. And the changes being affected have to be something that is to strengthen or add a warning, improve dosage, or administration to make the use safer. If it doesn't meet that, they have to get FDA approval first.
Interesting. Got it.
Reading some of the cases, some of the requests for FDA label approvals, 10 years later, that company hasn't heard back. So some of this becomes a very regulatory process, and you can understand why companies may not want to try to do anything. It's not like there's a quick response and let's protect the public. The FDA is working like a regulatory agency trying to get through the stuff that's submitted to them.
Got it.
Now, 1/3 of US prescriptions are off-label. And you see a little bitty print after that. That's the source. The Congressional Budget Office came up with it in 2016, that 1/3 of prescriptions are on the off-label usage. And whether they're exactly right or wrong, it's a large percentage. It's not half, but it's a large amount of prescriptions. And again, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question here. So sponsor cannot say off-label use, yes or no. Can FDA approve that, or it is still a doctor's discretion?
The FDA can add a label to deal with it, but how, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but mostly they won't. Mostly they just leave it alone. Remember thalidomide?
Yeah.
It was a drug set up to stop spontaneous abortions, and some children ended up horribly deformed. Well, later it was found to be useful as at a different dosage for dealing with some mental disorders. My bet is nobody went back and reauthorized it. And so you have this drug that was I don't know if it was withdrawn, but you probably have this drug that the original use is completely wrong. No doctor would ever do that. And you now have this secondary use that's just running around that the drug has what it was approved for isn't safe and effective, and it's being used sort of like a grandfather drug. So once you get a drug that's approved, it becomes like the grandfather drugs, which FDA is not regulating at all. This is the same kind of thing. The off-label use puts it in that category. And one can suggest when Congress set up the law, that's what they were worried about. And they trusted doctors to make a decision about what is appropriate for their patient once the drug is okay for some use. That's what it sounds like to me.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. And the FDA has authority to add a required drug label to address off-label uses if it makes the following findings. One, it's commonly prescribed. If you've got one guy in Ohio that's prescribing stuff, it doesn't sound to me like FDA has the power to do anything. Number two, a lack of substantial evidence of the effectiveness for off-label use. One can argue that's why we're hearing for certain therapeutics that there's lack of substantial evidence, because they're, I think, parroting exactly this language. But one could suggest that if you have a meta-study or something else, you can argue that they don't have that. And three, such usage is associated with serious risk of hazard. Not just some people get hurt. And the serious risk of hazard, I would think, would be judged in comparison to what drug risks are approved by FDA. So if we have a drug that's being approved that kills 5% of the people and your off-label use kills 2%, I think if you went to a court, they'd say, wait, if the other is okay, why isn't this? And anything that the FDA would do here would be government action that could be appealed, go into a court and say, wait, the FDA exceeded their authority, they didn't meet these requirements, and on and on.
Understood. Very interesting.
And then the last point is generic drug makers have to have identical labels as the sponsor. They have no choice, no flexibility. They're just here to provide cheaper drugs that are exactly the same as the sponsor's drug. And their test is not whether it's safe and effective. Their test is simply, does it do the same thing as the sponsor's drug?
Got it.
And there's a number of people I know that believe that the name compound and the generic have different effects in their body, different efficacies or whatever. Different
Isn't
side
that
effects.
because their generic may have different molecules in addition to the drug molecule, and that might actually create a difference?
It might be. I would not underestimate the power of the placebo effect and the person thinking they're getting not quite as good a drug or something.
That's correct.
But I mean, I have no idea. And no one is ever going to run a study to figure it out. I mean, if you're a generic drug manufacturer and people say your drug doesn't work, are you going to start running tests to prove your drug doesn't work? No. You've got approval, you'll sell it. And if you aren't selling as much as you want, you just lower the price a little, you know? I mean, I just think that's a great question, but I just don't think legally anyone is going to spend the money to try to figure it out.
Got it. So there's a comment from four-time Sayer. The FDA does not approve uses at all. The FDA merely determines whether to approve or clear products for marketing and labeling of the intended use submitted to it. Got it. So the approval means really that what the submission was some intended use. When they said approval, that is approval for that use.
It's really, I mean, my summary, and people that work in FDA all the time may say I'm wrong, but I think it comes back to the label. What they're really approving is this label and that drug are safe and effective and describe it appropriately.
Got it.
The next page. And so what's the problem that we're talking about? Well, the FDA was just setting up what the real problem. The real problem is the states have duplicative regulation. Most states allow those harmed to recover money from the manufacturer if the drug is not safe and effective, or the equivalent, as interpreted by the jury in that state, who don't know, don't care, and won't hear anything about the FDA regulations and approval. They'll decide it based on, oh, he's got 3 medical experts that came in and said, well, that's really not very safe. My patient got hurt. Even if it's a very well-known side effect, it still doesn't mean that they can't recover money. Now, failure to follow FDA requirements would be evidence of negligence, because failing to follow a rule is evidence of negligence. Like you're speeding down the road shows that you had some negligence in how you were driving the car. But following the requirements almost never will be admitted, won't even be told to the jury. When you think about an auto crash, will someone come in and say he was driving under the speed limit before he hit him? No, no one will talk about that. Same sort of thing. And these state tort laws existed prior to FDA regulations. And the word tort is a legal word that is just the same as crime. A crime is a wrong committed against the state that the state wants to punish a citizen. A tort is a wrong done against another citizen, and the state is allowing one citizen to seek usually money or order against another citizen.
Interesting.
And some people say, well, isn't there a federal supremacy clause in the Constitution that says, hey, if the federal government has a rule and the state rule conflicts with it, federal rule wins, right? Isn't that going to solve the problem? And the answer there is yes, there is such a clause, but there's a problem. Let's go to the next slide if we can.
And Rima is saying torts are civil.
Right. Civil versus criminal. There also are there are crimes against or wrongs against the state that are civil that the state would enforce. So a tort not only would be civil, but it also would be, the state wouldn't be a party to it.
Got it.
And so a tort is a private wrong, those being harmed sue. And what happens when the FDA doesn't allow a drug maker to comply with state law? And so you have one government agency saying you can't change the label, and the other one saying you're liable because you didn't change the label. This is typically what happens. State courts typically look at the federal stuff, their eyes glaze over or whatever, and they said, yeah, we're going to allow liability. And if the federal courts say no, then okay. And wait for the Supreme Court to basically say, if you like, one of the little movies, Not Today, Zurg. Remember Toy Story? Anyway. And the federal courts are very reluctant to find preemption of state law and to say there is no liability. Let's go to the next. There's 2 Supreme Court cases. And if you remember, the FDA rules started in 1938, and this is a 2009 case. So we've had a fair period of time before this was sort of clarified. And it's Wyeth versus Levine. And there's this drug, Ferragine, and there's the generic name. It's an antihistamine used to treat nausea. If it's injected into the arteries, it's caustic and causes severe damage, usually causes gangrene and amputation. And in this case, a person came in with nausea. They were given this drug and another drug. They went away. They came back and said it doesn't work. And the nurse practitioner was told and gave it to him again. And they did an IV push of this drug and apparently got it in the artery. The woman trying to avoid nausea, got gangrene, had 2 amputations, one of her hand and the other of her forearm.
Wow.
And so this is a very appealing plaintiff. And the drug was approved in 1955, and the label was revised several times. And this is one where over 10 years after they asked for a change to talk about this not doing the IV, the FDA said, no, leave the verbiage the same in the label.
Wow.
And then they were sued and they won. And they went to the Supreme Court and said, wait a second, the FDA told us we couldn't change the label. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you know, there's this clause called change being effective where you could make a change and ask the FDA for approval. You know, you can't just ask them and sit there. You had this ability. So we're going to say you're liable and you pay for the state claim.
Wow.
Right.
So then what they declared liable?
Yes. The Supreme Court said that the sponsors are liable for it. The change being effective, remember, only applies to sponsors, not to the generics. And so they said, because you could have done something and you didn't try and show that the FDA said no to you again, even though you had a pending request to put something in for 10 years and they told you not to do it, you didn't try this other change being effective. You could have changed the label and then had the FDA slap you down. And perhaps if you had done that, we would say you're okay. And that we would say that you had no way to comply. But don't say you had no way to comply if you had a limited way that you didn't try.
I got it.
Now, 2 years later, there was a Pleva versus Menixin, and they had a drug that to treat digestive tract problems. And this was, they prescribed the sponsor's drug, but the pharmacist gave them the generic, cheaper drug. And the side effect is this tardive dyskinesia.
Tardive dyskinesia. Tardive dyskinesia. Yep.
It's a severe neurological disorder, which I guess doesn't get better when you stop taking it.
Yeah. There's a,
and this drug was approved.
There's a damage in the brain that occurs.
Okay. It was approved in 1980. And it was approved for adults and not juveniles. And the label said there was no evidence at all about its effectiveness or its risk to juveniles, but it was prescribed off-label. Later evidence showed 29% of the patients that were on it for a couple of years developed this neurological disorder. And later it was upgraded to the black box, the highest level warning of it. But the Supreme Court said, since the generic drug manufacturers couldn't change the label at all to be different than the sponsor, they had no choice. Federal law preempts state law, and they're not liable. So you've got the sponsor companies being liable and the generic companies not being liable for exactly the same label because they have to have the same label.
Makes sense.
Okay. So let's go to the next one. This is a recent case. About a year ago, January 29, 2021, Janssen & Janssen, the same guys that make the vaccine, had a petition for certiorari in the Supreme Court. They had this drug, and if you will pronounce it for me, Drbeen.
Risperidone or risperidone.
And this is also on the WHO list of essential medicines.
Yeah.
And this was used to treat psychotic disorders. And was first approved only for adults. And it causes male breast development. And it was used.
I think it is approved for the gynecomastia, so it kind of helps treat it.
Pardon
me? It helps treat gynecomastia.
No, it causes it.
Okay.
It treats psychotic disorders.
Oh, sorry. Yes, approved only for adults, causes gynecomastia. Got it.
And so it was strictly said it was only for adults, so it was an off-label use. Later on in 2006, it was approved, but during the period where it was off-label, 2.3% of the pediatric patients developed this disorder. They had 2 cases that they lost. One, they had $70 million of direct liability. And the other, they had $8 billion that was reduced to $6.8 million. They have 10,000 pending cases for use that occurred during this off-label period.
That's a lot of. So were they all rolled into this
No,
liability?
no.
But they are still going on.
The liability was for one case. And the one
Wow.
case was a child that was put on it. Once he developed the condition, he was taken off. Still a child. The mother required that he go back on it because it helped him deal with his psychotic disorder, even though she knew what the side effect was. But still, the state court gave him $70 million.
So Rima says this is where informed consent comes in.
Right. Well, the jury wasn't told that he was put back on it. The judge decided that wasn't important.
Wow.
And the Supreme Court was kind of busy that year, last year, and they didn't take the case, just leaving Janssen & Janssen to deal with the state court cases. And they have 10,000 pending cases.
Wow. So in this particular case, what went wrong?
Well, one can suggest that the state courts should have looked at this and said, it's an off-label use. The court this whole idea of change the label and ask FDA approval that the Supreme Court had in their first case can't work in this because it's off-label. They can't say anything about off-label. Well, the state judge and the state appellate courts didn't address that issue adequately, according to the Janssen & Janssen lawyers. They decided that it wasn't precluded, that there wasn't a conflict, the supremacy clause didn't apply, and Janssen & Janssen is liable under state law.
Got it. So in this, I think we are coming to the end of this presentation. FDA's role, how does that expose a company or protect a company with this kind of liability?
Well, talking as the drug manufacturer, they would say they don't have the ability to change a label as they find new information, or if they look at old information in a new way. And the state courts may say, wait a second, 2 years ago, we had 5 of these cases, or someone ran an analysis and said, suddenly, rather than 3%, it's 5%. You should have done something. Well, they go to FDA, and FDA says, well, we're thinking about it.
Got it. Got it. Very interesting. Should I go back to the presentation?
Yeah, the last thing I have is, does anyone remember the Dow Corning breast implant issues? Well, Dow Corning never lost a case, but the whole company went bankrupt over just the number of lawsuits that were filed. The company reorganized and has continued, but they lost the whole company over it. So I'm saying a company like Janssen & Janssen and these other drug companies, their legal departments have to be very, very worried about cases like this. Yes, Madonna Rose, they did rupture, but let me tell you a little history about that. The gel that was used for the breast implants was invented during World War II to keep keep water away from electronics, because they could, in the South Pacific, because as the water is condensing and everything, particularly on the radar for the submarines and such, that the water would float on the top because the silicone gel was heavier, and they could go in and replace parts or whatever, and when they took it off, the gel would seal. And after World War II was over, someone realized the density happened to be the same as human fat density. So when they had doctors that had women that wanted larger breasts, they actually injected the gel directly into the breast. And then they had complaints because there was gross migration, that the breasts would be bigger for a while, but then it would migrate down to their bottom or to their ankles, and for some reason the patients were complaining about this. And so they put a bag around it to stop the gross migration, but not because there was a toxic effect. So there was some concern that the bags did break, but there wasn't any science to show that it had caused any trouble. And so that's what the Dow Corning people argued. And again, they won all of their trials, but just the cost of litigation was so overwhelming, they went through bankruptcy to get rid of it.
Got it. Thank you very much. So this is definitely, for me, there is a lot of new things there to see, and little more clarity for how drug companies, FDA, the regulations, the rules, the red tapes, the state laws, the Supreme Court, all of them play in. So it's not just an easy thing for a drug company to go and say, all right, I'll change this or I'll change that.
Right. And you and I can sit here and say, why are they opposing this? Why couldn't they do something that's good or whatever? And they're sitting there and seeing this whole forest of constraints and regulations and problems. And their people are saying it took us 10 years to get approval to do it. And you've got a 2-year pandemic. Why would we even try?
Got it. Well, thank you very much. I know that you are actually, right now, you have COVID. And I kept an eye on you during your talk to make sure that you are, I will puncture here and there to give you a breather as well. But thank you very much for giving us your time, and thank you very much for sharing this knowledge with us.
You're quite welcome. And I'm not saying that I think the drug companies are what they're doing is perfect or right or whatever, but just wanted to share this new idea or concern of one of the constraints that they're dealing with.
I want to comment on this one. I actually believe on the presentations in this pandemic's time, majority of the people who are presenting have taken some side and they are anchored there. And what I wanted was to present a lot of still within. So my bias is I do not go too much to the left or too much to the right or too much deep to the conspiracy and what I think is conspiracy. And I stay within a balanced circle. And within that circle, I want to have all kind of discussions. And these are very interesting and important discussions at our coffee table. So thank you for adding to it.
You're quite welcome.
Cool. So thank you very much for being here. Kool Beans, thank you very much for your time as well. I am going to hang up and then come back for the chit chat. We have reached 500,000 subscribers. I was speaking with someone that I never actually started to say I should have this many views or these many subscribers. I just wanted to say, I'm a medical educator. Can I present more of that education at this time of need? So let's have a quick chit chat as well. Paul, once again, thank you so much, and praying and wishing for you, your family, get well soon and become fully healthy. And we'll have you once again.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your new milestone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.